7.8%. So persons with disabilities in the US 1990 survey have shown that they have better business acumen than persons without disabilities. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. In terms of violence, and these are quite startling, for every child killed in warfare, 3 are injured and permanently disabled. In some countries, up to a quarter of disabilities result from injuries and violence, says the World Health Organization. Persons with disabilities are more likely to be victims of violence of rape, according to a 2004 British study, and less likely to obtain police intervention, legal protection, and or protective care when they report the crimes. Research indicates that violence against children with disabilities occurs at the annual rates of 1.7 times greater than for non-disabled peers. I'll just go through, because I know there's a legal panel later on, briefly. The general principles of the convention, which are respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices and independence of persons, non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, and we'll come back to that inclusion word many times during the course of today. Respect for difference and acceptance of persons, and acceptance as opposed to tolerance. I hate that word tolerance. With diversity and humanity, equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, which may seem simple, but it's not really in the world in which we live. Respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, and respect for the rights of children with disabilities to preserve their identities. I'm going to frame a lot of my presentation in the context of education, because education, to me, is a great metaphor and paradigm to compare the other services that persons with disabilities are not provided for in terms of society, in terms of support, and in many cases, financial funding. Now, my area of training is special education, and I must admit I stumbled upon it by mistake. I had the pleasure of being introduced to a very qualified and passionate professor from Andrews University called Dr. Rudolph Bailey, where I had a conversation with who, and after I finished my undergrad, really encouraged me to go into special education training. And let's Shada come in. And I'm now also reading for my PhD in educational psychology, because of what I encountered in media and in general life in Trinidad and Tobago, which is really an apathy and an unfortunate dissonance and silence when it comes to the rights and support services for people with disability, particularly in the educational sector. And I have seen several administrations come and go and promise change. And also because of my work with several organizations, including the Autistic Society, I see Mr. Stewart is here, the Down Syndrome Family Network, the Kids and Family Network in St. James that provides support services. I've seen the challenges families go through on a daily, weekly, monthly, and annual basis in just getting basic educational services for their children and family members, which is in most cases heartrending, because when you listen to the rhetoric of the politicians, and I'm not a politician, fortunately or unfortunately, you get a sense that persons with disabilities are second or third class citizens. They don't have a voice. Politicians don't seem to think that they can vote you into or out of power. So they have very little political capital. And as such, like the elderly or like children, are treated as if they don't have any rights. And they don't have the right to basic services. As I said, I'm going to talk a lot about special education in my discussion. And is because I think not only education services for persons with special needs, but education to the general population as to what really constitutes special needs, disabilities, and the fact that this is something that will affect us all, as we said before, in one way or another at some point in our lives. It is not a blight we're giving persons. It is not a handout. It is not a favor. This is their right. This is our right. And it is time that we stop treating it as if it's a blight or a favor or an accommodation of some kind. Our Constitution in Trinidad and Tobago says equality of treatment for all. We have a long list of rights that should be attributed to every person, including the right to education, the right to free speech. But are those rights being supported by the systems in Trinidad and Tobago, by the structures? And I dare say no. And governments come and governments go, and very little is done to ensure that the rights of persons with disabilities are ensured, particularly in the educational sector. Now, there are 13 categories of special education as defined by the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, in the US. They include autism, blindness, deaf or hearing impairment, emotional and or behavioral disorders, and I'll get back to behavioral disorders because it is with great chagrin that I keep hearing the utterances of those in authority and their responses to antisocial and behavioral issues of young people in the nation's schools, as if the punitive, reactive measure is going to bear fruit in the long run. Quite frankly, it's a stupid response. It's an uninformed response. And it is a response that is going to keep us going in circles for decades to come. It is not proactive and it is not productive, but we'll get back to that later on. Intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairments, special and language impairments, traumatic brain injury, visual impairments. What is special education? It makes possible for a child or an individual to achieve academic success in what is described as the least restrictive environment, despite their disability. As I said, I'm going to put a lot of what I'm going to in the framework of education because I think education is a great parallel for all the other services that should be supplied to persons with special needs or persons with disabilities. IDEA, which is the Individual with Disabilities Education Act in the US, and that's a good basis for us to learn in Trinidad and Tobago, entitles all children with learning disabilities to an appropriate education, including a specific program, class for your child, access to specialists, modification of the educational systems and goals, including curricula and teaching method. In terms of special education, it pertains to students ages in the US 3 to 22 years who attend public institutions. It provides by law funding for persons or children with disabilities or special needs, because as we all know in Trinidad and Tobago, and as we all know with families of persons with disabilities, it is in some cases extremely expensive. And $5,000 a year from student support services does not in some instances meet the needs of 1 week or 1 month. It ensures that the child or the person is treated as an individual. It ensures that the child or the person's family is included in the process. It ensures that the education system caters for, in every which way, the person with disabilities. And the interesting thing about it is most of the information that we have about, in terms of research, points to the fact that nearly 70% of us or more have some sort of disability, have some sort of intellectual impairment. It may not impact our functionality to the point where we need special services, but we all have some sort of disabilities. We are not perfect in any way. And it's time we stop treating the situation as them or us.
Amen.
There are several paradigms that have shifted in the US and the UK that have enabled their systems to, by law, by the Constitution, provide these services. And I'm glad Mr. Saunders, in his presentation, spoke very much about rights. I think the rights issue, as a human right, is the direction we need to go in Trinidad and Tobago. Right now, it is a policy decision. Right now, you get the impression that it is optional in some instances. Right now, you get the impression that it depends on the person you're dealing with in a particular school. And I'm not saying it's all bad, because I've seen some situations in schools in Trinidad and Tobago where services are provided. But we know they're few and far between. One of the landmarks is to bring the issue of rights home in this situation in the US is the issue of Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, Topeka, where on a fundamental level it was about race and segregation. And I'll outline 2 or 3 other cases that kind of exemplify the importance of legislative change and it being a part of the law, the legislative system in the country, where it is not optional. It is mandatory by law, and that parents and families have the right to legal recourse if services and support systems are not provided. In that case, we all know in the 40s and 50s in the US, it was very commonplace to have blacks in black schools and whites in white schools. And of course, we all know that in the black schools there were less resources, and in the white schools there were all the resources, leading to many to believe, because there was obvious underperformance in many of the black schools because all the services weren't provided in many cases. So much so that there was the overall perception, sadly at that time, that, well, blacks are less intelligent than whites. Similar to what I read earlier on, where the suggestion is that, well, persons with disabilities are performing at a lower level than persons without disabilities. But it's really about the support services. Anyway, in this case, it went on, and it became a landmark case in the United States, where the Supreme Court eventually ruled that it was unconstitutional and illegal for there to be segregation in schools. And that started a whole movement toward integration in schools. It didn't happen overnight when the laws were changed, but it certainly gave a platform and a legal background for persons to challenge the status quo. To say, my child, whether black, brown, white, green, or yellow, has a right, a legal right, to go to any school he or she desires. And that, to me, is the foundation of where we should be going in Trinidad and Tobago. There are several other cases that came up thereafter that really showed how far the struggle has come, or how far the struggle had to go. In many cases, and I'm seeing so many familiar faces here when I'm looking into the auditorium, where persons who take their child to get an education, because we all want the same things for our children. Whether persons feel our children are differently able, disabled or not, we all want the best for our children. We want our children to have a sound education. We want them to, at some point, to be independent, to be able to take care of themselves. And if the system is not providing for that, it is extremely heart-wrenching for parents and families. In terms of some of the cases that I'll outline, there are several cases, for example, Schaefer versus Wiest, where the court held that a party seeking relief in terms of the process, just simply the process, if the process for determining if a child needs services did not include the parents, did not explain to the parents all the options. The parents have legal rights. If a child needed, in some of the cases, in one of the cases, medical intervention in the institution, the school, by law, had to provide that. The schools, by law, have to provide funding for special needs educators, by law. If the school did not provide it and the parent had to go to a private institution, the state had to pay for it. Because the education system said that we are providing education, equal education for all. And equal education for all does not necessarily mean 5 books, I almost said a laptop computer, or 3 pencils. If my child needs more special services, that is what my child needs. My child may need a little more attention than another child. And that is what the system needs to be providing. That should be my child's right. It should not be optional. It should not be up to a teacher, a supervisor, a principal, though well-intentioned, as to how much and the degree of services my child needs. It should be a right. It should be a right in every educational institution, in every educational setting. And I know we have persons from the Equal Opportunities Commission here who will speak more on that later on this morning. You see, the issue of advocacy, and I really have to commend so many of the groups for the work they've been doing over the last 10, 15, 20 years, has come to a critical position in this country where we have to take it one step further. There have to be changes in the laws in the country to support the groups, to support the families. Otherwise, the advocacy can continue for 20 more years. And that is 20 years of unfulfilled potential of the nation's children. And these children, families, have just as much potential in their own right. We also need to consider that when we look at our education system, we tend to look at persons with disabilities as only persons with physical disabilities. So when we have almost 40% underperformance rate in our primary schools and secondary schools, we have to ask ourselves, is our system working? Are we identifying persons with special needs or disabilities in the system? And we're not. We have a knee-jerk reaction to poor grades. We have a tendency to focus on the top 10 percentile or the top 3 percentile. We see every year after the SCA, the education minister in one incarnation